Hi. I hope we want this to be a very interesting session. I've known Zach for 25 years. Zach was involved in the beginning of major label digital engagement. I'm going to let Zach talk for a few minutes, give you a little bit of his background, and then we're going to talk about where things have gone and where Zach is taking them with his company, Super Hi-Fi. So why don't you do
the
early years, the 2 minutes? Well, do 4 minutes. You got.
Okay,
It's a lot of stuff. It's a guy you need to talk to after this panel.
So we have a very strong perspective on where digital music is going. Extremely specific, very strong perspective on where things are heading. And the reason why we're focusing on it, and I'll talk about me in a minute, but the reason that we're focusing on it in this way is because this realization that we have that everything that all of us are doing, music technologists from every aspect of the industry, everybody I think that's here, we're all focused on really one thing. Everything comes together at the moment where music leaves a speaker and gets into a consumer's eardrums. Because that's the moment of delight, right? Every aspect of the music business kind of lends itself to that and exists for that reason. Without it, there's no enjoyment, there's no commerce, there's no touring, there's no recognition of artists, there's nothing. So record labels exist to find the artists and help them to get monetized. There's publishing companies, there's technology companies, streaming companies, everybody. And everybody talks about the metaverse and everybody talks about NFTs and all these things that we're starting to hear. It still doesn't really matter unless somebody's actually listening to an artist. And the thing is that today, the way that digital music services exist are great. They've expanded really dramatically. Obviously, Spotify and Apple and Amazon, Deezer, Qobuz, and the rest of those are the dominant forms of consumption for music today. But they're all really the same. They're really just the same product with a different skin on top. And what we see starting to happen is a dramatic shift towards differentiation and entertainment in a way that actually radio companies have been mastering for many years. And so what I'll talk about in a minute is why we see that actually broadcast radio, which is a often maligned industry, is the direction that digital music services are going to ultimately find. They're going to copy. In some respect, they're going to embed some of the techniques of broadcast radio to give themselves the differentiation that they need to ultimately be successful over the long run and to delight consumers, listeners, in a way that they haven't yet been delighted. So that's what we're going to talk about in a minute.
Now talk about your humble beginnings.
Okay. So I've been doing digital music since as long as there's been digital music, right? Like you have.
Right. But we met in like 98, 99.
Yeah, we met before that, man. I think it was like 1995.
But talk about the first real interaction we had was over FarmClub. So explain how FarmClub came to be, how you got involved in that, and what it was supposed to what it represented. Actually, not supposed to, what it represented.
Yeah, so I started out in the music business in very traditional way. I went to music school. I moved out to Los Angeles when I was a kid to go to music school. I ended up working at music retail stores, selling guitars and keyboards and stuff to bands. That's where I started to really kind of to understand what the music business was all about. Ultimately, I ended up booking artists at a nightclub called the Troubadour in Los Angeles, which has been around for a really long time. I think it was formed in 1956 or something like that. And that's what I thought I was going to do, was to be a booking agent at some point. I really liked the idea that we could connect artists to live experiences that would delight fans and tie all that stuff together. But I learned about the internet in and around 1994.
Yeah.
And started to build websites, which back then was the cool thing to do. And artists started to hire me to build their early websites, and record labels started to hire me to build their websites. And ultimately, I found that to be much more enjoyable, and I thought that it could have a much bigger impact. And my belief was that all music would become digital pretty quickly in 1994.
Right.
So I was about 15 years early.
Right. And 3 years before MP3.
Yeah, way before MP3.com.
Well, before the format MP3 was IUMA in 94.
That's right. Right. So I started to do websites and ultimately broke into digital music, and that's really where, in and around late 1999, I was brought into one of the earliest kind of online record labels called FarmClub.com, which was started by Jimmy Iovine and Doug Morris at Interscope and Universal Music, respectively. And that was short-lived, but really interesting because it pointed the way towards where things ultimately were going to get to. I think that Jimmy Iovine, you guys may know him as the guy who started Beats Electronics and ultimately sold it to Apple Music and started the Apple Music subscription service. But he had a vision for that, 15 years earlier that ultimately took 15 years before it became something. I moved away from that. I ended up running Virgin's global digital music platform called Virgin Digital, where we had early versions of online radio and online music subscription services. And when that shut down, when the Virgin group was selling off all the mega stores, which you guys might remember, we saw the writing on the wall and kind of handed our keys back to Richard Branson and started a digital agency to start building things for other people that we had been building for Virgin for the 7 years that we were there. And we ended up building a ton of digital music services. We built all the streaming media platforms for CBS Radio, which at the time was the largest radio company in America. We built AOL Radio and Yahoo Launchcast when those were brands that really mattered. I think one of the products that we were proudest of building was one of the earliest subscription music services built into a phone and a rate plan for low-income consumers called Move Music in the States for a company called Cricket Wireless, which ended up being a really, really big platform and one of the earliest success stories in the digital landscape.
And it dealt with an issue that we always talked about, that if we could get music services bundled into a device, whether it was cable, whether it was a mobile phone, that once it was bundled in there, you wouldn't opt out. Once you experienced it, you'd stay.
Yeah.
In the case of Cricket, it was built into the cost of the phone, so you didn't even feel any. It wasn't like you got 3 months free and all of a sudden your bill went up $10.
Yeah, but the interesting proof point there was that Cricket Wireless was a company for low-income consumers that didn't have credit cards, didn't have computers, and would wait in line every month to pay their bill in advance in cash. And the thought was that if you could give them high-quality digital music experiences, that maybe they would stick around for a little bit longer because their dropout rates were massive, right? When you don't have a contract and you don't have a credit card, it's pretty easy to just let your phone bill go when you need to maybe pay for rent or food that month. When we went live with Move Music, what we actually found was that it increased not only average revenue per user, which is a metric that you use in the mobile space, but also it reduced churn, which is the most important metric for mobile.
Right.
Because to the point that you just made, music experiences are so important that people will forego their rent and food to pay for the phone that has their music on it in a way that they had never done before. And what that indicated, it indicated to us that music is obviously in the digital space is really important, but what it indicated to the record labels was there's a huge market there that may be untapped in the earliest phases of them doing licenses for companies like Spotify and Apple and others.
So let me ask you a question before I'm going to talk about super hi-fi and what you're doing now. But I mean, one of the things that I had worked with Zach about 10 years ago, he created a platform called Hello Music, which was basically Overstock.com for music gear. So it was Fender guitars on special today. We only have 100 of them, Fender Squiers or Fender Telecasters. So it was closeouts, and it made, in a lot of cases, music instruments and guitar pedals and chords and keyboards that normally were unaffordable. Zach had people like Rick Camino that were going out and finding bargains from Roland and Fender and Gibson. And it was a great thing at the time. But what I wanted to ask you before we go into what you're doing now is there has been this overall belief that, quote, the music industry, and we say the industry, the Universals, the Warners, whatever, completely got it wrong. And I'm very defensive about that. In your, to be as objective as possible, if you look back at the last 25 years, what did they get wrong, and what do you believe they got right?
I think if there's one primary thing that they got wrong is that they held on to the idea that they controlled the formats that people were going to consume music through. They held on to that for too long. So it's record labels that decided, colluding with each other that, records would be the primary form of distribution, cassettes would be, 8-tracks would be, and then ultimately CDs would be. And when the consumers started to move to digital, the record labels decided they wanted to control the move to the next format as they always had before.
And they actually pulled vinyl. They pulled it out of the market.
Because they didn't want anybody to use it anymore. They made more money on CDs because they could charge more for something that looked cooler than than a vinyl album. And when things started to move to digital, they didn't make the move quickly enough. And so the market made the move for them. And ultimately, they were forced to do licenses that were reasonable enough to consumers that they'd pay for it, and still high enough in terms of the fees that they could make money off of it.
Right.
But ultimately, at the end of the day, they're winning. And the artists are winning too, those at least that are successful enough to get enough plays on these services. Artists are doing, the labels are doing what they've always done, and they're doing a really good job of it. They're the VCs for bands. They find the right talent. They help to hone their skills. They get them the right producers. They get them in the studios. They spend money on marketing them, and the hope is obviously enough people will listen that they'll start to make some of their money back.
Right.
So yeah, they made some mistakes, but in the grand scheme of things, they're doing a great job for artists. And I still don't, to this day, know any artist that wouldn't sign with a major label if offered the right deal. No matter how interesting it is to do it yourself, there's still a cachet, and it's still a tremendous amount of opportunity to be signed by a big major label.
Right. So talk about the philosophy behind creating Super Hi-Fi.
Okay. So how many of you guys use Spotify, I imagine, or Apple Music? Right, everybody these days. Right. These companies do a fantastic job of providing access to artists. If you know what to search for, even in some cases if you don't know what to search for, they've editorialized or their algorithms are good enough to help you find music that you may want to listen to. And the growth rates of Spotify and Apple Music and the like have been meteoric. It's shown that they're doing a really good job. But the problem is that if you close your eyes when you're listening to any of those services, like let's just use Spotify as an example. If you select your favorite artist, Taylor Swift, I imagine. Select Taylor Swift, listen to Taylor Swift on Spotify, and close your eyes. How do you know you're listening to Spotify? You don't. There's nothing to distinguish the experience once you've selected the artist from any other service that exists on the planet. The only difference is the credit card bill at the end of the month.
If we go back to radio in the, quote, golden era of radio, when you listen to a, quote, Drake Chenault station, the jingles, the Pam's jingles, you're listening to da-da-da-da-da, number one then. There was a identity. There was a...
Well, it's what we would call differentiation.
Right.
Right? And the challenge with a lack of differentiation is that no business that has a lack of differentiation ever ultimately survives. What ends up happening is when things are completely replaceable without any change in the experience that you're having, they become ultimately a commodity. Right. A great example of that would be laundry detergent. Laundry detergent, it does an excellent job of cleaning your clothes. The technology of laundry detergent has evolved to the point where you don't even really have to think about it anymore. You know you're going to put your clothes in the wash, and it's going to come out pretty clean. Most of the stains are going to go away. But they're all the same as each other.
Right.
So the only thing that these companies can fight on these days is price. There's no brand value there. Companies like Spotify risk becoming laundry detergent if they don't do something to capture the imagination of their consumers in a way that's different than what anybody else is doing. Now, the way that they've approached it is by starting to invest in things like podcasts that are different.
Right.
So a great example is Joe Rogan on Spotify is not really available many other places. You can get snippets on YouTube, but other than that, that's the only real place that you can get the podcast. And that certainly helps. But it doesn't necessarily help enough because the vast majority of people are not going to Spotify for Joe Rogan. They're going there to listen to artists. And the artist's experience is the same as everybody else's. And it makes sense why. It's the same catalog as everybody else, right? The labels are the ones who deliver the catalog. The digital services are just the ones that give it out to consumers. They have effectively the same sound quality, give or take. They have effectively the same technology.
Right.
Right? So all these things are basically the same. How are they supposed to differentiate from each other? Well, one of the things that we noticed through all the different things that we've done in our careers, myself and my team, and we've been together for a really long time, is that there is this other industry that has exactly the same challenges. And that industry is broadcast radio. Broadcast radio, which, again, it's a dying industry, but I'm going to talk about it in the most glowing and positive of terms because there actually are a tremendous amount of kind of valuable nuggets to be found there. They have the same challenges that a Spotify has. They have the same basic playlist challenges. They have the, right? They have the same content as anybody else. They have the same sound quality as anybody else. They have the same interface as everybody else, which is the car radio. You just get to press a button, and then maybe you can change the dial. And yet, in any major market, at least in America, and I imagine in many other places around the world, there are always multiple stations in the same market that play the same things. So for instance, a country station in LA, if you look at the top 2 country or the top 2 hit stations, they're the same exact music playlist. The top 40 that they're playing are the same. And yet one of them is invariably going to do twice the revenue and have twice the listeners as the other. And so you start digging and you go, why? Why is that? Why does a country station get twice the listenership as another country station when it's the same basic station? And the answer is it's not the music itself. It's the space between the songs that activates the experience. It's the other content, right, that radio stations are actually really good at developing. Right. It's the personalities that help tell a story. Because without a narrative, how are humans supposed to connect to anything, right? We are storytelling machines. That's how we communicate best is with stories. And it's also the production aspects of it, the fact that there's no space that's actually left, that people are being pulled through a tapestry of a listening experience rather than just being given these discrete things, a song followed by 8 seconds of silence, followed by another song, followed by another 8 seconds of silence. Radio is actually the set of techniques or the industry that points the way for how the digital music services are going to differentiate themselves and in the process build brand relationships with their listeners that are fundamentally different than anything else that's out there. And by the way, I am positive enough about this that I am saying will, not might. Right. But this is what will happen.
I think that's one of the things over the years that people say, what are the possibilities? And we used to talk about, no, it's the inevitabilities. It was inevitable that we would pretty much get where we are now. Maybe it took 5 years longer than we wished, but we got here.
It is inevitable.
But we're not done. I want to interject with a story. My son, who's 29, lovely person, is in the weed business. I don't know if anybody wants to meet him. I'll give you his contacts. But I had dinner with him a couple weeks ago, and he goes, he was miserable. I said, what's wrong? He goes, the weed business is over. I said, what do you mean? He said, everything that's going to be done has been done. And I went, bullshit. I said, Shep Gordon managed Alice Cooper, but he also manages chefs. I said, I'll introduce you to Shep. We'll find a chef that wants to do a line of cannabis cupcakes. And it'll be Gordon Ramsay's weed cupcakes, whatever. I said, it's not done. There's innovation's going to continue to happen. I said 2 years ago, Spotify thought we were done. And then TikTok came along. And now I'm sure TikTok believes we're done and something's going to come along to upset that apple cart.
Yeah, we're not done. I think we're in the third inning, to use a baseball term. We're not done. We're towards the beginning, right? Spotify is the first service that proved that you could have a standalone business that does music streaming. They're the first to do it.
Right.
And then others have followed, and there are blips of success. But it still is it's still working itself out. Spotify just recently actually talked about how they need to get 10x the revenue that they have. But here's the amazing part: is Spotify's revenue globally is $11.5 billion. Right. The radio market in America alone is $18 billion. So again, it's an industry that is off maligned, that does not have a lot of respect, is losing listeners, but in the U.S. alone does twice the revenue that Spotify does globally. And points the way to where everything is going technologically. So I'm going to talk you through why I'm so utterly convinced that this is where things are going to go, and why I think that those that are interested in providing
but you still
value
have 2 minutes.
to that
You haven't
space,
explained what Super Hi-Fi does.
I will in a minute. And this is more about the vision for where things are going, and not just what we're doing.
Secret recipe for Bush
But if you look at every single one of the digital music services that are out there, look at Spotify, look at Apple, look at Amazon, look at Deezer, look at any of them. They're all investing in what seem like radio features. Spotify has something called Your Daily Drive. It's music interspersed with voice tracks and interspersed with podcasts. Look at Apple Music and all their investment in Apple Music Radio as what they call the tip of the spear to getting people to actually pay for the digital music services. Amazon has something called DJ Mode. DJ Mode is broadcast radio DJs, not club DJs. And they just launched a product in the States called AMP, which is a do-it-yourself radio platform. Deezer has Flow, which is a lean-back radio listening experience. All the energy is going into things that sound and feel like radio. And so now, in the last minute or so that we have to talk,
we'll keep going.
I'll talk about why we started Super Hi-Fi.
Right.
We believed that in order to do this, in order to get digital music services to sound and feel a little bit more like radio, you needed the ability to have something like a DJ that was actually making content selection and production decisions. Right? On air, you have a DJ that's doing that. You're aligning the songs so that they all they transition perfectly. You have a voice track that talks over the songs in the right way and brings a narrative value. Or maybe you have an artist interview that goes with the song that you're going to listen to that brings it to life in a way that hasn't been brought before. On air, that's easy. One person can make those set of decisions and production decisions and broadcast it out to 1 million people that are listening. But in the digital space, it's the opposite. If there are 1 million people that are listening, you need 1 million DJs in real time, and that's not very cost effective.
Right.
So we knew that you were ultimately going to need some sort of algorithm, what ended up being AI that we created, to make those decisions in real time that sound and feel artful and human and DJ-like, but are actually happening instantaneously, hundreds or millions of times a minute. And that's basically what Super Hi-Fi is. Super Hi-Fi is the underlying automated production tool that allows companies like our customers to use that to create radio-like experiences. And so today we have companies like Sonos, Peloton, iHeart, Australian Radio Network, and many, many others that are using this. And today we drive about 1 billion of those decisions a month, and it's continuing to grow really rapidly.
Very cool.
Is that a good
That was good.
fast?
They're giving us the overtime, but we're not that overtime. We have time for a couple questions? Questions? Anybody? Marcel, what do you want to know? Nothing? You're okay? Mwah.
Challenges.
Challenges.
No questions?
This is good. That means we've done an extremely thorough job of educating the audience.
Perfect.
Wait, we have a
Paul.
question.
Paul. What's your name? Sir Paul? Sir, no, he's not McCartney. Never mind. Sir Paul.
I'll go with sir. Thank you. I'm curious how much you think broadcast really will die off. How quickly are we going to get to more satellite-driven radio into cars and so forth, as opposed to maybe plugging in our phones? Is it really going to converge at some point, and how
I
soon?
mean, right now, iHeart's the hedge.
Yeah, it is actually dying. And I think if you talk to the broadcasters, they'll deny it every way that they can. But there's a lot of data that indicates that mobile listening this year of digital music streaming is finally overtaking in-the-car broadcast streaming. It's about 35% of the share of ear, they call it, the amount of time people spend listening to things, is still in the car, and about 35.2% is streaming through the phone now. And it's been going down for about 10 years. If it continues that way, it'll be a shell of itself in a decade. But what often happens is with these types of changes is they accelerate over time. And so it's very possible that in 5 or 6 years, broadcast radio could be pretty neutered as an industry very, very quickly.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. How do you integrate this with the current services?
How do we integrate with them?
Yeah, like with Spotify, with all DSPs, or is just another service different of all of them?
So it really depends on who the service is. It's AI, so think of it like a toolbox, right, with a whole bunch of tools in it. Some people will use the tools to build a piece of furniture. Some people will use those tools to build a house. And we partner with our customers in very similar ways. For some of them, like with Sonos, they have about 880 radio stations globally that they push through their speaker system in different territories, like 80 or so per territory. All the production is done using our AI. With Peloton, it's very different. They have live fitness experiences, and so their needs are going to be fundamentally different than somebody like a Sonos. Or Australian Radio Network, they're the largest broadcaster in Australia. They're using us to create things that sound exactly like broadcast radio, but that are online only, and where they don't want to put the whole production team on that they would have for a broadcast radio station. They could just hand it to the AI. So every company is different, but the AI's fundamentals are basically the same. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Okay.
Anyone else?
Cool.
Oh, wait, we got one more.
Do broadcasting, so radio stations also use your technology so that they run their shows more efficiently with less people?
Yeah, that's what's next. I'll share just a personal challenge being a startup that's been growing pretty rapidly for 5 years. is that it is difficult to take an industry like radio that's existed for the way that it, for as long as it has, and where there's been such a tremendous lack of innovation for like 25 years, and help them to understand the benefits of really advanced technology like real artificial intelligence. But we do have a number of very large broadcasting companies, and ultimately the goal is to help them to power their radio stations at massive efficiencies relative to what they're spending today. So yeah, 100%, man, that's a big focus for us.
So let me ask a question. Did you work with Lisa Crane at all?
Yeah.
Did you work on Soundbreak?
Yeah, I didn't work with her on that, but she was very, very early in the online radio space.
So
yeah.
Soundbreak was the first attempt at 24-hour-a-day live radio out of LA. And the challenge that they realized was the concept of morning drive or afternoon drive, day parting had to go away because they were working on a world clock. And how do you provide, it became a real challenge, A, to be local, and B, to be time of day relevant.
Yeah.
Because when it was drive time in LA, it was 3 in the morning in London.
So I see Jerome over there. I know that everybody's waiting for lunch. So I will end it on this note. You just actually made a really important point, and I think this is a part of what's going to make digital experiences so unique.
Ignore him.
Radio is, they know local. They do, they understand local, and that's important. They understand context. They understand content, they understand personality, and they understand production. And those are the ingredients of tomorrow's listening experiences, whatever they end up being. They're going to be designed in such a way that it'll feel like it's designed for you where you are at the right time and at the right place, but with still all the kind of on-demand entertainment value that a company like Spotify or Apple Music offer today. And you're right, she was very, very early, and that had to get figured out. Well, it's 22 years later. That's been figured out. So
Okay.
it's definitely time.
All right, thanks everybody. Enjoy lunch.
Yeah, thank you guys very much.
You got food for thought now.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Ted. Thank you, Zach. It was really insightful.